Welcome to all of you, and blessings of the springtime to you all. The spring equinox is celebrated for the coming of light, but it is precisely a time at which light's absence is felt in exactly equal measure. We're drawn to expressions of light, like the flaming chalice, because they dispel darkness and bring clarity. But the occasion of the spring equinox reminds us that we must not neglect what lies outside the rational circle of illumination. And it is in that spirit in which I invite you to join with me this morning in reconsidering assumptions and looking beyond the surface of institutions which have, in fact, a mythic dimension. And so, first, a myth. When the terrible battle frenzy came upon Cuchulainn, he changed out of all recognition. From crown to sole, his whole body trembled like a bulrush in mid-torrent. He made a mad, whirling feat of his body within his skin, so that his heels, his calves, and his hams appeared in front. He drew one eye back into his head, and the other stood out huge upon his cheek. His hair bristled all over his head like hawthorn, with a drop of blood on every single hair. From the ridge of his crown there arose a thick column of dark blood, like the mast of a great ship. It is no wonder that the people called him the Contorted One. Now, a messenger to the king of Ulster cried, "A solitary chariot fighter draws near to thee now, O Conor, and terribly he comes. The chariot is graced with the bleeding heads of his enemies." "I know that little chariot fighter," Conor said, "the little boy, my sister's son, who this very day went over the border. Surely he will have reddened his hand, and should his fury not be timely met, all Ewan Macha's young men will perish by him." So they hit upon a method to abate his rage, the result of having drawn blood, and it was this. The women of Ewan Macha, 60 in number, bared their bosoms and trooped out to meet him. The little fellow leaned his head against the rail of the chariot and shut them from his sight. All unawares then he was seized and doused in a vat of cold water which was ready for the purpose. In this first vessel, the heat generated by his immersion was such that the staves and hoops flew asunder instantly. In a second vat of water, the water escaped by boiling over. In yet a third, the water still was hotter than one could bear. By this time, however, the little boy's fury had died down in him. From crown to sole, he blushed a beautiful pink red, and they clad him in festive clothes. Thus, his natural form and feature were restored to him. We can perhaps all agree that war is repellent, and the violence of war equally so. In this tale, the people of the kingdom of Ulster were determined to guard against its intrusion as they might a plague. And yet warfare accompanies humanity down through the generations. And indeed, we celebrate, we honor those who undertake it on society's behalf. Is war inevitable? Psychologist James Hillman notes, during the 5,600 years of written history, 14,600 wars have been recorded, 2 or 3 wars each year of human history. Anthony Stevens, in his book, The Roots of War and Terror, observes surviving bands of hunter-gatherers do not display warlike propensities does not mean that they do not have them. We know from studies of the Kalahari Bushmen and their cave paintings that these gentle people have been warlike in the past. They are no longer so because, like the similarly Pacific Eskimos and Pygmies, they inhabit inhospitable territories which no one wishes to take from them. War is ancestral. It is phonic. It is rooted deep in the very soil, in the land itself. Hillman, again. Think of Iraq's history. What is that history but thousands of years of wars and killings? Millions of people have died on that earth and become part of it. Their bodies are part of the land, the earth we are breathing. The worst bloodshed in the Western theater of the Civil War, notes Hillman, occurred at a place that had already long before been named in Cherokee, Chickamauga, River of Death. Now, if war is indeed inevitable, can we live with war? And at what price? What toll does the God of war exact from us? The simplest answer, I think, the soul of the warrior himself or herself. The warrior is shadow. He is that within us which we unleash like Cullen, the smith's hound, against the other. But he is also the other within us, and we deny and we even fear him, even as we ask him or her to protect our integrity, even as the soldier remains outside it. As for the Romans, the cult of the god Mars was maintained outside the walls of the city. For these duties, the traditional compensation has only been the immortality of mythic fame. Now, can we, moderns, do we have that coin, even, to pay that wage, when our warriors are too often anonymous soldiers sent to battlefields whose names we can scarcely pronounce? We fear the autonomy of warfare, the way it cannibalizes. Recall Cuchulain's threat to his own community in the tale I just shared. But also the Irish warrior bands, the Fianna, were not simply mythic poet heroes, but they were resented burdens during the seasons in which they had to be billeted within the community and kept in room and board and drink. And military coups and rules by juntas down through the years have demonstrated the seductive nature of the notion that might makes right, and the invitation for the warrior within the community to overturn the rule of law. But let's look deeper into the myth. The warrior was often seen as literally a predatory beast. Cuchulainn was described as a beast in maddening anger, a terrible bear. He is death to the herd of cattle. Another Irish warrior, Labred, was described as shaking his head like a wolf in battle. Mythic tales from many cultures are full of images of the warrior as a sort of werewolf figure. Homer employed the Greek word lysa, which means both warrior fury and rabies. Again, the link between soldier and implacable beast. The berserkers of Norse tradition were described as dogs or wolves. They were strong as bears or bulls. Neither fire nor steel would deal with them. And this is what was called the fury, the wut, of the berserker. It is this particular lycanthrope, this werewolf, we fear and we need. Recall Cuchulain's tenure standing in for the hound of the smith Cullen in my earlier story. And recall the description of the ferocity of the dog's attack, for which the boy agreed to stand instead. Not only individuals, but societies can be possessed with warlike frenzy. Carl Jung likened the psychic state of Nazi Germany to possession by the warlike aspect of the god Wotan. And surely we have seen similar mass will to war in our own society. It's here in the notion of transformation of both individual and group, the reshaping of individual and group, that we move into the heart of the matter. This transformation is not merely change, not simple change. It is depersonalization. The soldier must acquire two basic characteristics: loyalty to the warrior core and to the hierarchy it is subject to, and willingness to destroy human life. The first inevitably requires a breakdown of the self, and the second, a depersonalization of the adversary. And for a society to send forth the warrior requires, in at least some measure, at the very least, the latter of the two. We hear of selfless acts in battle, where a soldier saves a comrade. These are honorable and courageous acts in the field of battle. But in the spirit of the equinox at which we gather, in the words with which I opened this discussion, we must acknowledge at the same time that that selflessness implies no less than a dissolving of the self for a larger purpose. This happens in one of the most elaborate of rites of passage, the initiation through training and through testing into a warrior corps. This tradition does no less than separate the recruit completely from the community and into the war band. And at the same time, the new warrior is taught to depersonalize the enemy, which is quite literally to cease identifying the adversary as human. Hillman says in passing, an unexpected appearance of the enemy as an ordinary human being can unnerve the citizen soldier. During the Spanish Civil War, where George Orwell had gone to fight fascists, as he says, he could not shoot at a man partly dressed, running along holding up his trousers because, in Orwell's words, a man holding up his trousers isn't a fascist. He's visibly a fellow creature, similar to yourself, and you don't feel like shooting him. Bruce Lincoln lists several epithets typically attached to the enemy: monster, a beast, and many others. We might notice that these are not too unlike the descriptions of the warrior himself in the myths I've shared. The mythic warrior operates beyond the border, as Connor said Cuchulainn had gone. He operates in the realm of the other, the adversary, and in some ways, he operates as the other. To turn to the Irish tales again, a warrior god, such as the Irish Lugh, was successful in battle because he was, in fact, of half divine and half demonic parentage. But we don't live in the mythic hero's world. We live in a contemporary society of equals, and often of conscripts to battle, where the warrior is often looking not for imperishable fame, but as a way out of unemployment and poverty. The result can be selfless acts of heroism, but sometimes the result can be Abu Ghraib. And when the warring ends, for a time, then what? The returning warrior, like Cuchulainn, is still transformed. He or she has gone through a ritual of separation and initiation and is still in the world fantastical. Hillman notes, war is unreal, fantastic, unimaginable, because war's very explosive unpredictability is imagination itself on display. The warrior inevitably works beyond the community's borders in the world of the liminal, the world of the boundary, like Cullen's hound. To simply bring home the warrior without reversing the initiation is to ensure precisely the ills our veterans so often suffer. 33% of male homeless are veterans. 76% of vets suffer alcohol or drug or mental health issues. 35% of veteran convicts are in prison for violent crimes versus 20% of non-vets. There's a need for a rite of passage back. And society often needs rituals of its own as a whole for closure and healing after warfare. Consider the Nuremberg trials after World War II, for example, as a restatement of the rule of law and order after the lawlessness during the war. I'm aware of individual spiritual groups and traditions that are beginning to experiment with these sorts of rites of passage and return for the warrior. I was made aware of one notable effort in the Puget Sound area recently that focused on blessing and preparing a recruit prior to shipping out to Iraq. This was a lengthy ritual that lasted overnight, more than one day. One would like to see similar undertakings for veterans returning home. However, as is so often in the case of veterans' affairs, these sorts of spiritual efforts are tentative and in their infancy. Effective ritual, as the anthropologist Victor Turner defined it, requires separation, as is the case when the warrior is trained in boot camp, and the building of a group for the enactment of the ritual, the establishment of what Turner called communitas. Now, sadly, de-initiation before re-entry into society, and with as powerful a group formation aspect as basic training, simply does not exist. We are left to try to pull together a possible patchwork menu of approaches. So let's return to those three cauldrons, those three vessels in the tale once again. What do we note? Cuchulainn must be cleansed outside the boundaries of the community. The training, the transformation of the warrior happens outside. So the repersonalization perhaps may need to happen there as well. Can we afford a ritual process as extensive and expensive as basic training is to untrain the soldier? Perhaps not, but perhaps there is something suggestive in comparing the pattern of the myth with the methods of, say, residential rehab programs. A second aspect of the tale, the women at the cauldrons. They divert the warrior's attention. James Hillman calls attention to the notion of the moral equivalent of warfare. If we consider that, and the idea of the many women in the tale who are sent to subdue and cleanse a warrior capable of killing many men, maybe in that symbolic equivalence of female power and male power, we might find an aesthetic or an artistic, or perhaps even a charitable equivalent of war, something to which the veteran's attention might be turned, something as compelling and socially meaningful as the call to duty during the time of warfare. But what about the veteran's self? That which has been torn down by this initiation. For that, depersonalization is at the root of many of the ills when the veteran returns to the community. There are 3 other cauldrons found in the Irish tradition, in a work called the Cauldron of Poesy. Perhaps we are meant to see these particular cauldrons in the vessels into which Cuchulainn was thrice immersed. The first of these was the Cauldron of Warming. This is deep in the belly, and it is upright at birth, apt to be filled. It represents the physical body and is present always, no matter the condition of the physical body. The second is the Cauldron of Vocation, found in the heart and tipped on its side, only partly filled. The task of writing and filling this cauldron of the heart is the task of shaping, or in this case, reshaping purpose. Only with clear purpose, compelling purpose, will this vessel be filled. Finally, there's the Cauldron of Knowledge, in the head and found completely inverted at birth. This will be the last and hardest to raise upright and fill. This task requires wisdom, and this wisdom must come before the will of the individual can be applied and the individual can be truly whole. Perhaps the lesson of this final cauldron, the Cauldron of Knowledge, points to our responsibility to provide opportunity for the returning warrior who may have only sought the battlefield out of lack of education or employment to be educated for a meaningful career in the community. Perhaps this, education, is the last and most meaningful step in a grand ritual of transformation as powerful as that which empowered the warrior to step out of the community on our behalf